The setup. Jabari Ellington had always believed in the system. It was flawed, yes, but it could be fixed. That was why he dedicated his career to criminal justice reform, why he spoke at universities, lobbied for policy changes, and trained law enforcement on proper conduct. So when he landed in Birmingham, Alabama, for a weekend lecture at the University of Alabama, he had no reason to suspect that by the end of the night, he'd be in handcuffs, accused of a crime he didn't commit. The evening had been smooth. After his speech, he grabbed dinner at a small family-owned restaurant downtown, where an older couple recognized him from a television panel on police accountability. They chatted for a while about corruption, wrongful convictions, and how the legal system disproportionately targeted minorities. Jabari had these conversations all the time. He was used to the statistics, the patterns, the heartbreak of innocent men and women spending decades behind bars due to systemic failures. What he wasn't used to was it happening to him. He had just stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air, when the sound of screeching tires broke the peace. Blue and red lights flashed. A patrol car lurched to a stop in front of him. "Hands where I can see him," the voice barked. Jabari barely had time to register what was happening before two officers jumped out of the vehicle, guns drawn. "Sir," Jabari said slowly, his hands raising in compliance. "What's this about?" He had taught students how to handle police encounters. He knew the right words to say, the right tone to use. Keep calm. Don't make sudden movements. Ask clear questions. But theory and reality were two very different things. "Shut up. Turn around," the officer snapped. "Hands on the car." Jabari hesitated for half a second. That was his mistake. A strong hand shoved him forward. His chest hit the cold metal of the police cruiser. His pulse quickened. A third officer stepped out of the vehicle, older, heavier, with a smirk that made Jabari's stomach twist. "Pat him down," he ordered. Jabari's breath came out in slow, measured exhales. "Stay calm. Stay in control." Then one of the younger officers stepped back, holding a small plastic bag, a bag filled with white powder. "Cocaine." The older cop chuckled. "Look at that. What do we got here?" Jabari's body stiffened. Planted evidence. He had seen the cases, read the reports, worked on overturning convictions based on this exact scenario. And now, it was happening to him. "That's not mine," he said, forcing his voice to remain even. "You know that's not mine." The officer tilted his head, amusement flickering in his eyes. "That right?" He turned to his partner. "What do you think, Miller?" "Think he's telling the truth." The younger cop, Officer Miller, grinned. "Not a chance. Looks guilty to me." The handcuffs clicked around Jabari's wrists. People on the street had stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones. But the officers weren't worried. They had done this before. The older cop turned to a woman who had lifted her phone to record. "Back up, ma'am. Unless you want to join him." Jabari's mind raced. He could fight back. Not physically. Legally. Logically. He could insist they check for fingerprints, review body cam footage, call a lawyer. But he knew how this game worked. They would turn off the cameras. The evidence would disappear. The charges would stick. So, he stayed quiet. In the patrol car, the older cop sat in the front seat, whistling. "You got family, son." Jabari ignored him. "You know, it's funny," the cop continued. "All you boys got the same story. I didn't do it. I was just minding my business. Same tired lines. We could recite them in our sleep." The younger officer, Miller, laughed. "Maybe we should start betting on which excuse we hear next." Jabari turned his head toward the window, fists clenched. He wanted to tell them who he was. He wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized. But not yet. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, the Jefferson County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, attorneys, law students sat in the back, eager to observe another open and shut case. Jabari sat at the defense table, his hands resting calmly on the surface. Beside him, his court-appointed attorney, a young, overworked man named Brian Leclerc, flipped through paperwork, stress evident in the way he tapped his pen against the folder. "Listen, man," Brian whispered, leaning in. "I've seen these cases before. Judge Stokes, not exactly known for being lenient. Your best bet is to take the deal." Jabari turned his head slightly. "And what's the deal?" Brian sighed. 5 years, maybe 3 if you keep your head down and don't make any noise." Jabari's voice was smooth, calm. 3 years for something I didn't do. Brian shifted uncomfortably. "I hear you. But these guys..." He glanced toward the prosecution's table, where Assistant District Attorney Joel Patterson was chatting casually with the very officers who had arrested Jabari. The same officers who had planted the drugs. They were laughing, exchanging inside jokes, relaxed, like they had done this 100 times before. Jabari's gaze flickered to Sergeant Raymond Givens, Officer Miller, Officer Denton. They weren't even pretending to be worried. Sergeant Givens caught Jabari's gaze and smirked, shaking his head slightly. A silent message. "Don't even try." Jabari inhaled deeply. No, he wasn't going to let them win. "Let's go to trial." Brian's pen tapping stopped. His shoulders stiffened. "You sure?" Jabari met his eyes. "I'm sure." Brian hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right." Judge Howard Stokes entered the courtroom, a man in his 60s with a reputation for swift sentencing. He settled into his chair, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the case file. "Let's make this quick," he muttered. Assistant District Attorney Patterson stood, buttoning his jacket. Confident, in control. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed. We have clear and overwhelming evidence against the defendant." Jabari tuned him out. He already knew how this speech went. A routine performance. He had watched it play out in different courtrooms, in different states, against different people who never stood a chance. He felt the eyes of the room on him, waiting, expecting him to fold. The prosecution called Officer Denton first. Denton adjusted his uniform, placing a careful hand on the Bible before swearing in. He was lying before he even opened his mouth. Patterson approached him, exuding confidence. "Officer Denton, let's go over the events of August 17th. Tell the court how you came into contact with the defendant." Denton cleared his throat. "We were on patrol near 8th Avenue North, an area known for drug activity. We observed the defendant leaving a restaurant. When he spotted us, he immediately changed direction, appearing nervous. That's when we decided to conduct a stop." Jabari didn't react. He had expected this. "Tell us what happened next," Patterson prompted. During the stop, the defendant refused to comply. At first, asking unnecessary questions. Eventually, we conducted a lawful search, during which we discovered a small bag containing a controlled substance in his jacket pocket. Patterson turned to the jury. "Let the record show that the substance tested positive for cocaine." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Jabari glanced at Brian. He wasn't even objecting. The defense wasn't fighting this case. They were letting it happen. Jabari's gaze shifted to Sergeant Givens. The officer smirked. They thought it was over. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. The smirk that sealed their fate. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation. Every move, every word, every glance carried weight. This wasn't just another routine trial. Not for Jabari Ellington. He had spent years studying these moments, dissecting the cracks in the legal system, watching innocent men and women be processed like cattle through courtrooms just like this one. He had seen the quiet despair of the falsely accused, the confidence of prosecutors who didn't care about guilt or innocence, only convictions. But this time, the system had the wrong man. Sergeant Givens smirked. That smirk, that smug, knowing curve of his lips, was what sealed their fate. Jabari knew it in that instant. They thought this was just another day, just another easy win, another black man thrown into a cell while they went home, collected their bonuses, and did it all over again tomorrow. They had no idea that their world was about to collapse. The prosecution pressed forward. Officer Miller took the stand next. He was young, early 30s maybe, a man who had probably learned from older cops like Givens, absorbing the culture of corruption like secondhand smoke. Miller sat tall, hands folded, speaking with the crisp professionalism of a well-trained liar. "We conducted a lawful stop," he said. "The defendant displayed nervous behavior, and based on our training and experience, we had reason to believe he was in possession of illegal substances." Patterson, the prosecutor, nodded approvingly. "Could you clarify what you mean by nervous behavior, Officer Miller?" Miller tilted his head as if considering. Avoiding eye contact, changing direction when he saw law enforcement. These are indicators we've been trained to recognize. Jabari almost laughed. Avoiding eye contact, changing direction. That's all it took to justify a stop. The courtroom was silent as Miller continued, painting a picture of a guilty man, an image so well rehearsed that it could have been lifted from a training manual. After we stopped the defendant, we engaged in a conversation, during which he became defensive. At that point, Sergeant Givens gave the order for a pat-down. That's when we discovered the controlled substance. Miller's voice remained even detached. Lying was second nature to him. Patterson stepped forward, smiling slightly. "And to be clear, Officer Miller, were you wearing your body camera at the time of the arrest?" Miller nodded. "Yes, sir." "And did it capture everything you just described?" Miller hesitated. There it was. The slight pause. The flicker of doubt. "Yes, sir," he said, but his voice lacked the same crisp confidence. Jabari filed that away. Patterson turned to the jury. No further questions. Brian, Jabari's court-appointed defender, stood up reluctantly. Jabari could tell Brian didn't want to be here. Didn't want to challenge the officers. Didn't want to risk his reputation, his future, for a client he had already decided wasn't worth the effort. He approached the witness stand slowly, flipping through notes he wasn't really reading. "Officer Miller," he started, clearing his throat. "You say my client changed direction when he saw you. Did he run?" Miller blinked. "No." "Did he make any aggressive movements?" Miller hesitated. "No." Brian nodded. "So you stopped him, just for walking?" Patterson objected. Argumentative. "Sustained," Judge Stokes muttered. Brian exhaled through his nose. He had barely tried, and already he was retreating. Jabari clenched his fists under the table. This guy wasn't here to win. He was here to lose quietly. "No further questions," Brian muttered, already walking back to his seat. Jabari barely resisted the urge to laugh. The deck was stacked. It always was. Except this time. The dealer didn't know who was really at the table. The prosecution's last play. After Miller stepped down, Sergeant Givens took the stand. This was the real test. Unlike the younger officers, Givens had been in the game for a long time. His posture, his tone, his demeanor, it all oozed authority. "Sergeant Givens," Patterson said, "tell us about your experience in law enforcement." Givens nodded. 22 years on the force. I've worked narcotics, gang units, and street crimes. I've testified in over 100 cases. 100 cases. 100 stories just like this one. 100 lives just like his. Patterson paced slowly. "And do you ever cut corners, Sergeant?" Givens smirked. "No, sir. Everything we do is by the book." Jabari could feel the jurors absorbing every word. This was what they wanted to hear. A veteran cop. A public servant. A hero. Not a criminal in a uniform. Patterson continued his line of questioning. "You were the supervising officer on the scene. Did your officers act appropriately?" "Absolutely." "Was the search conducted lawfully?" "Yes, sir." Patterson turned toward the jury. "There you have it, Ladies and gentlemen, a veteran officer with decades of experience, telling you exactly what happened. No misconduct. No mistakes. He nodded, satisfied. No further questions. The silence before the storm. Brian stood, shifting awkwardly. He didn't want to cross-examine. Jabari leaned toward him. Ask him where the body cam footage is. Brian hesitated. Now, Jabari whispered. Brian nodded, clearing his throat. Sergeant, you stated that the officer's body cameras were active during the arrest, correct? Givens nodded. That's right. Where is that footage? A beat of silence. Givens tilted his head slightly. Technical difficulties. Jabari smiled. There it was. The crack. The moment everything changed. The courtroom air was thick with inevitability. Jabari could feel it. The weight of a verdict already decided. The jury sat still, their expressions unreadable. Some had taken notes. Others had just watched, waiting for the moment they knew was coming. Judge Stokes flipped through his notes lazily. All right, we'll move straight to closing arguments. Patterson stood first. Folks, this is simple, he began, stepping toward the jury. You heard the evidence. You heard from 3 trained officers, professionals who put their lives on the line every day. And then you heard from the defendant. He turned slightly toward Jabari, a man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He let the words settle. The law doesn't work on feelings, Patterson continued. It works on facts, and the facts are clear. He gestured toward Jabari without even looking at him. You know what to do. He sat down. Brian hesitated before standing up. He tugged at his tie, swallowed hard, and shuffled toward the jury with all the energy of a man who had already given up. Ladies and gentlemen, he started. I just ask that you consider reasonable doubt. I mean, we weren't there. So we don't really know. He cleared his throat. That's all. He sat down. Jabari exhaled slowly. It was over. The jury had already made up their minds. The officers were relaxed. Patterson was confident. Judge Stokes was ready to move on. And then, Sergeant Givens smirked. That was his mistake, because that was when Jabari decided it was time. Before the judge could finish his sentence, Jabari leaned forward, his voice calm, steady, unmistakably in control. Your Honor, he said. The judge looked up, annoyed. Mr. Ellington, your attorney had his turn. I understand, Jabari interrupted. But before we proceed, I'd like to introduce myself properly. And just like that, everything changed. The game they never saw coming. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with routine anticipation moments ago, was now frozen. Every eye turned toward Jabari Ellington. The defendant. The accused. The man whose fate they thought they had already sealed. But now he was standing, not as a desperate man begging for leniency, but as something else entirely. Something dangerous. The judge frowned, his impatience flickering to confusion. Mr. Ellington, what do you think you're doing? Jabari reached into his jacket pocket, the same pocket where the planted drugs had supposedly been found, and withdrew a small black leather ID case. He flipped it open. The golden badge inside gleamed under the courtroom lights. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters surged forward, cameras clicking. The officers who had so confidently orchestrated his downfall just hours ago stiffened. Sergeant Givens' smirk vanished. Judge Stokes blinked. What? Jabari held up the badge for all to see. 3 bold letters glinted in the light. FBI. And beneath them, Jabari Ellington, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Silence. The kind of silence that stretches taut, suffocating. Then, like a dam cracking under pressure, the courtroom erupted. Whispers. Gasps. The rapid, frantic typing of reporters racing to break the story. The jurors exchanged stunned glances. Their entire reality had just shifted. Judge Stokes paled. Assistant District Attorney Patterson swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. And the officers. The officers looked like they had seen a ghost. Jabari let them feel it. The fear. The realization. The sinking knowledge that their perfectly rehearsed playbook had just been ripped apart. Slowly, he lowered the badge, placing it on the table in front of him. Then he spoke. His voice was even, controlled. "Liffle, you and your men did a very thorough job," Jabari said, looking directly at Sergeant Givens. Givens' jaw tightened. His hands, which had been so steady before, were now gripping the table. "You made sure the evidence was convincing," Jabari continued. "You even had a cooperative defense attorney to make sure nothing got in the way. Brian, his court-appointed lawyer, looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. But you made a mistake." Jabari tilted his head slightly, letting the moment stretch. For any other man, this would have worked. His voice dropped slightly, just enough to make the entire room lean in. "But I'm not just any man." Boom. That was the moment. The moment everything changed. Panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. It started with Givens. His eyes darted to the exits, to the judge, to Patterson, searching for a way out. There wasn't one. Miller. He had gone pale. The sweat beating at his temple made his perfectly pressed uniform look suddenly unprofessional. Denton. The quiet one. The follower. His breath had quickened. The smirk was gone. And now, Jabari was the one smirking. Judge Stokes cleared his throat, struggling to regain control. This is highly irregular." Jabari turned to him, his expression neutral. "Is it?" he asked. Judge Stokes froze. Because for the first time since he had slithered onto the bench, he realized something terrifying. Jabari wasn't afraid of him. Not even a little. The bomb drops. Jabari reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small black recorder. Click. A low beep filled the courtroom. Then, the sound of laughter. The crackling audio of Sergeant Givens' voice filled the air. "You know, it's funny. All you boys got the same story. I didn't do it. I was just minding my business." The room collectively inhaled. Miller's voice followed. "Maybe we should start betting on which excuse we hear next." The same words they had mocked him with the night before. Now, they were a noose tightening around their own necks. Givens' face twisted. "That recording is taken out of context." Jabari pressed play again. The exact moment when Givens had chuckled and said, "We could recite him in our sleep." Boom. That was it. That was the moment Sergeant Raymond Givens lost everything. And he knew it. The courtroom erupted. Gasps. The frantic scribbling of reporters. The jury, who had been so close to convicting Jabari just minutes ago, looked horrified. Patterson, the prosecutor, stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is..." Jabari turned to him. Cold. Calculated. "Sit down." Patterson's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Stokes slammed his gavel. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." But there was no more order. Not for them. Because order belonged to Jabari now. The reckoning. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 3 men in dark suits entered. Federal agents. Jabari nodded toward them. "Gentlemen, you know what to do." The agents moved in. Givens stumbled back. "Now hold on." One of the agents pulled out handcuffs. "Raymond Givens," the agent said, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, perjury, and falsification of evidence." Givens lunged. The bailiff grabbed him. Miller tried to speak. It wasn't my idea. I was just." The agent behind him clicked on another pair of cuffs. "Save it." Denton didn't even fight. He just nodded. Because he knew. It was over. The system cracks. Judge Stokes was fuming. "This is outrageous. You." Jabari turned toward him. "You signed off on hundreds of cases just like mine," he said. The judge's face reddened. "How many innocent people have you sentenced?" Jabari asked. "How many plea deals did you push through without a second thought?" The courtroom watched. No one spoke, because everyone knew the answer. Jabari turned to Patterson, the prosecutor. "And you?" Patterson flinched. Jabari stepped closer. "How many times have you looked the other way? How many cases did you ignore the holes in?" Patterson's lips parted. I had no idea." Jabari cut him off. "Stop." The word landed like a gavel. "You had a choice," Jabari said. "You could have done the right thing. You didn't." He nodded toward the federal agents. "Take them all." And just like that, the system cracked. Jabari turned toward the exit, picking up his briefcase. He didn't look back, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The hunter becomes the hunted. The moment the handcuffs snapped shut around Sergeant Raymond Givens' wrists, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted. Power had flipped. The same officers who had orchestrated his downfall just yesterday were now being led away, their uniforms suddenly looking less like badges of authority and more like costumes. The press devoured the moment. Microphones were shoved forward. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered frantically into phones, racing to be the first to break the story. Breaking news from the Jefferson County Courthouse. A bombshell revelation. The accused was actually the FBI director himself. Jabari let them talk. Let them write their headlines. Let them document every second of the downfall that these corrupt officers never saw coming. But he wasn't done. Not even close. As the officers were escorted toward the exit, Jabari stepped forward, stopping just inches from Sergeant Givens. The man who had once laughed at his supposed fate now stood before him, his face pale, his breath uneven, his confidence shattered. Jabari leaned in. "You thought I was just another statistic," he said quietly. Givens didn't move. "You thought I'd get lost in the system, like so many others." Jabari watched him, studied the fear in his eyes. "Not this time," he said. And then he turned his back on him. Just like that. Because Sergeant Givens was no longer a threat. The unraveling begins. As the last of the officers were let out, the courtroom descended into chaos. Judge Stokes slammed his gavel, his face red with fury. "Enough. This is still my courtroom." Jabari turned slowly. His eyes locked onto the judge. His smirk returned. Not anymore. The courtroom fell silent. A chilling kind of silence. The kind that signals a reckoning. Judge Stokes stiffened. "You're out of line." Jabari tilted his head. "Am I?" He stepped forward. "Because from where I'm standing, Your Honor, you seem nervous." Judge Stokes glared at him. "This is highly unprofessional." Jabari cut him off. "This isn't about professionalism. It's about justice, something you seem to have ignored for a long, long time." Judge Stokes exhaled sharply. "You have no evidence against me." Jabari smiled. Then he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. Judge Stokes froze. The color drained from his face. Jabari placed the folder on the table, tapped it. "This," he said casually, "this is a full federal investigation into you." Boom. The reporters went wild. Judge Stokes gripped his gavel like it was the only thing holding him upright. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. Jabari opened the folder. Page after page of court transcripts, case files, patterns of misconduct. "All these convictions," Jabari said, flipping through the pages. "So many people processed through your courtroom, rubber-stamped into prison. Unquestioned. Unchecked." He paused. Then he looked up. "How many innocent people have you sentenced?" Judge Stokes' hand twitched. Jabari didn't let up. "How many people begged for justice while you looked the other way?" "Nothing." The judge said nothing. Because he knew. They all knew. And now so did the entire world. The prosecutor's last stand. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Joel Patterson was breathing too fast. Jabari hadn't even turned his attention to him yet. But now it was his turn. Jabari walked over, slow, purposeful. Patterson didn't move. He sat frozen, watching the judge crumble before his eyes. "How long have you been working under him?" Jabari asked. Patterson swallowed. How many cases did you push through?" The ADA looked trapped. "I didn't." Jabari cut him off. "Don't lie to me." The words were soft, deadly. The entire courtroom was watching, waiting. Patterson licked his lips. I was just following orders." Jabari raised an eyebrow. "So that's your defense? You were just doing your job?" Patterson looked around frantically, as if someone might save him. No one did. Jabari leaned in slightly. "You want my advice?" Patterson hesitated. "What?" Jabari smiled. Cold, calculated. "Get a lawyer." The chain reaction. Within minutes, federal agents entered the courtroom. Not just for the officers, not just for the corrupt cops, but for Judge Stokes, for Patterson, for everyone who had played a role in this rigged system. Panic spread like wildfire. Judge Stokes stood suddenly. "This is outrageous. I have judicial immunity." One of the federal agents placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll have a chance to explain that in court." Judge Stokes' eyes darted everywhere. No escape, no power, no control. Not anymore. Jabari watched as the same system they had abused turned against them. It was poetic. It was justice. It was long overdue. The walkout. Jabari stood still for a moment, watching, taking it in. The courtroom, which had started as a trap meant to bury him, was now the scene of a total system-wide collapse. Reporters swarmed the halls outside. The headlines were already spreading. FBI director exposes corrupt Alabama courtroom in shocking undercover sting. Judge Stokes, top prosecutors, and officers arrested in bombshell case. The system just got a taste of its own medicine. Jabari turned, picking up his briefcase. As he walked toward the exit, the jury, who had nearly condemned him, lowered their eyes. Shame, regret, realization. How many times had they done this before? How many innocent men had they sentenced simply because the case looked clear-cut? And Brian, the public defender who had refused to fight. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Jabari stopped beside him. Spoke without looking. "You want my advice?" Brian barely nodded. Jabari's voice was calm, final. "Find a new job." And with that, he walked out. The beginning of the end. The moment he stepped outside, the press swarmed. Questions flew at him from every direction. "Director Ellington, did you plan this investigation? How deep does this corruption go? What happens next?" Jabari turned to the cameras. Calm, composed. This wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about every person who had ever stood where he had stood. Every innocent life destroyed by a system that protected the guilty. And now that system was cracking. Jabari looked directly into the cameras. This isn't over. And with that, he walked away. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The dominoes keep falling. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. By the time Jabari Ellington walked out of the Jefferson County Courthouse, the entire legal system in Birmingham, Alabama, was imploding. Federal agents swarmed city offices. Court clerks, police precincts, and legal firms found themselves under investigation overnight. Every corrupt cop who had operated under Sergeant Givens, every prosecutor who had ignored bad evidence, every judge who had rubber-stamped wrongful convictions, they were all on borrowed time now. The system had spent decades crushing innocent people under its weight. Now, it was finally crumbling. The media firestorm. The moment Jabari left the courthouse, the press attacked. Microphones and cameras swarmed him. Reporters shouted over each other, desperate to be the first to break the next headline. Director Ellington, was this all part of a larger investigation? Did you go undercover to expose corruption? How high does this conspiracy go? Jabari paused on the courthouse steps, looked at the sea of flashing cameras. And then he spoke. For years, people have told me that the system is broken. But that's not true. He let the words settle. The system isn't broken. A hush fell over the crowd. He looked directly into the cameras. It's working exactly as it was designed to. Boom. The reporters froze, because no one had ever said it so plainly. The problem isn't that justice fails, Jabari continued. It's that justice has never been the goal. He took a step forward. The goal has always been control. More cameras flashed. More reporters fumbled for their microphones. But here's what they never planned for, Jabari said. He smiled. Cold, sharp, deadly. They never planned for someone like me. And with that, he walked away. The cover-up that never came. By the next morning, the story had gone global. News stations ran the footage on repeat. A massive FBI sting has exposed deep-rooted corruption in the Alabama legal system. Multiple high-ranking officials, including Judge Howard Stokes and Assistant District Attorney Joel Patterson, have been arrested. Hundreds of past convictions now face re-examination. For the first time, there was no cover-up. No sweeping things under the rug. Because this wasn't just one case. It was a system-wide failure, and the country was finally paying attention. The investigation deepens. Back in Washington, D.C., Jabari sat in his office at FBI headquarters. His desk was covered in case files, names, mugshots, court transcripts, people who had been railroaded by the same corrupt machine. He flipped through a file labeled Marcus Reed, convicted for drug possession, sentenced to 20 years. Based on evidence planted by Sergeant Givens. Another case, another life ruined. Until now. Jabari picked up the phone. Reopen the Reed case, he said. There was a pause. Sir, that case was closed years ago. Not anymore. He hung up. The dominoes weren't done falling. The plea bargains started. As the investigation deepened, the guilty started turning on each other. Judge Stokes, once untouchable, was now just another defendant, facing federal charges. His lawyers scrambled to make a deal. But there was no deal to make, because no one was coming to save him. And Patterson, the once powerful prosecutor who had built his career on rigged cases, now he was begging for leniency. Jabari met with his lawyer. You want to make a deal? Jabari asked, leaning back in his chair. The lawyer nodded quickly. My client is willing to cooperate in exchange for. Jabari raised a hand. Stop. Silence. Jabari looked Patterson in the eye. You sent innocent people to prison for decades. Patterson swallowed. And now you want mercy. The prosecutor looked down. He knew. There was none coming. The letters from prison. As word spread about the massive takedown, something unexpected happened. Letters started arriving at FBI headquarters. Hundreds, thousands, from prisoners, from families, from people who had been trapped in the system, just like Jabari had been. Some pleaded for help. Some told their stories. And some just wrote two simple words. Thank you. Jabari read every single one. Because this wasn't about him. It was about all of them. The unexpected visitor. One evening, as Jabari worked late in his office, there was a knock at the door. He looked up. A woman stood there. She looked tired, worn, but determined. She stepped forward. I just wanted to thank you, she said. Jabari studied her. For what? She pulled a photograph from her purse. A young man. Smiling. I'm Marcus Reed's mother, she said softly. Jabari's chest tightened. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, she whispered, my son might come home. Jabari stood slowly. For the first time since the trial, Since the chaos, he felt it. The weight of what he had done. Not the arrests, not the headlines. The lives saved. He nodded. "He will," Jabari said. "I promise." The war wasn't over. As the woman left, Jabari sat back down at his desk. The war wasn't over. There were more cases to fight, more names to clear, more corruption to expose. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting alone. He picked up the next case file. And he kept going. Because this wasn't just about justice. It was about changing everything. The final reckoning. Months passed, and the tidal wave unleashed by Jabari Ellington's revelation continued to surge, reshaping the very foundations of justice nationwide. The fallout was relentless, unforgiving, and far-reaching. Alabama was just the beginning. From Birmingham to Washington, corruption that had hidden for decades behind badges and gavels was dragged into the unforgiving glare of daylight. Politicians, police chiefs, district attorneys, and judges all felt the tremors of accountability. Jabari's quiet crusade had ignited a movement nobody saw coming. A reckoning that had been years in the making. But Jabari knew the job was far from done. The manhunt begins. One chilly evening, as autumn leaves spiraled gently outside his office window, Jabari received a confidential memo. It came from FBI Special Agent Cassandra Fields, one of his top investigators. She'd been tasked with tracking the web of corruption beyond Birmingham. Jabari opened the memo slowly, reading carefully. Director Ellington, we've traced further connections. This isn't isolated. Judge Stokes, ADA Patterson, and Sergeant Givens, they're linked to a larger national network. Officers, prosecutors, and even judges across multiple states are implicated. They called it Project Clean Sweep, a twisted operation targeting minority communities to inflate arrest rates and secure federal funding. This is bigger than any of us imagined. Jabari leaned back, absorbing every word. His pulse quickened, not from surprise, but from determination. He'd always suspected something deeper, something darker. Now, the full truth was emerging, ugly and undeniable. He picked up the phone. Agent Fields, assemble your team. It's time we finish this. Exposing Project Clean Sweep. Within days, FBI agents conducted simultaneous raids across 7 states. Homes, police stations, and courthouses became scenes of chaos as agents confiscated evidence. Corrupt officials were dragged into the open, their faces no longer smug and powerful, but stricken with disbelief. News broke quickly. Massive FBI operation uncovers nationwide corruption network. Project Clean Sweep expose. Over 100 officials indicted. Jabari Ellington promises justice at any cost. Public outrage ignited like wildfire, with protests erupting nationwide, demanding deeper reforms. Jabari's phone never stopped ringing. He became the face not just of the investigation, but of a movement hungry for change. Confronting the mastermind. As the arrests piled up, Jabari received word of one last name. Someone he had personally trusted. Someone he never saw coming. Federal Judge Malcolm Ramsey. Ramsey was a national icon of justice reform, a respected advocate known for his stirring speeches on equality. But now, hidden beneath years of commendable rulings was a sinister connection to Project Clean Sweep. Jabari felt a chill. He had admired Ramsey, considered him a mentor. The betrayal stung, but he knew what had to be done. Late one evening, Jabari confronted Ramsey at his D.C. home. The older man opened the door slowly, his face unreadable. "Jabari," Ramsey said calmly, "I've been expecting you." Jabari stepped inside without hesitation. "How long, Malcolm?" Jabari asked, voice tight but controlled. "How long have you betrayed everything you claim to stand for?" Ramsey smiled bitterly, pouring a drink. "I didn't betray anything, Jabari. I played the game as it was meant to be played." Jabari shook his head. "Innocent people rotting in jail cells isn't a game." Ramsey turned sharply. The system demands sacrifices. Stability requires control. Jabari's voice hardened. Control at whose expense? Marcus Reed. Hundreds of others. Ramsey looked away, staring at his reflection in the window. We built a legacy, Jabari. Progress demands compromises. Jabari stepped closer, voice low, lethal. Justice isn't a compromise. He placed a warrant on Ramsey's desk. You're under arrest. The trial of the century. Ramsey's trial became an event unlike anything before. Television networks covered every second. The world transfixed as one of the nation's most respected judges faced justice himself. On the final day, Jabari personally testified. His presence alone spoke volumes. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, the courtroom exploded in applause. Ramsey's composed mask shattered. The betrayal of justice was finally answered. Jabari watched silently from the back, feeling no joy, only grim satisfaction. There was nothing to celebrate here, only the sobering truth of how easily justice could be corrupted. Marcus Reed comes home. Several weeks later, Jabari stood at the gates of the Alabama State Penitentiary. A familiar face appeared behind the chain-link fence, stepping hesitantly toward freedom for the first time in 2 decades. Marcus Reed was thinner, aged beyond his years, but his eyes were bright with hope. When the gate opened, his mother rushed forward, embracing him tightly, tears streaming down her face. Marcus turned to Jabari, speechless. Words weren't necessary. Jabari simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Marcus was home. A legacy of change. In the months that followed, hundreds more wrongfully convicted individuals saw freedom. Jabari worked tirelessly, leading reforms and dismantling corrupted networks nationwide. Congress passed new legislation mandating greater transparency. Police departments nationwide faced audits. Accountability became more than just a promise. It became reality. And at the heart of it all was Jabari Ellington, the man who turned one night of injustice into a movement that shook a nation awake. The final message. Exactly 1 year after his wrongful arrest, Jabari stood before thousands gathered at the steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Cameras captured every moment. My name is Jabari Ellington, he began, his voice steady, powerful. But today isn't about me. It's about every person who stood helplessly before a system designed to crush them. Today, we choose accountability over power. Today, we reaffirm that justice isn't blind. It's awake, aware, and watching. Cheers erupted across the crowd. Corruption thrives in silence, he continued, his voice rising with conviction. But tonight, silence ends. Tonight, our voices demand a justice system worthy of our trust. He looked directly into the cameras, speaking to millions around the world. The fight is never truly over. We must remain vigilant, brave, and relentless in the pursuit of justice. No more compromises. No more silence. This is not the end. It's a new beginning. The crowd roared as Jabari stepped back, leaving his words to resonate long after he'd left the stage. A promise fulfilled. Late that night, Jabari sat quietly in his office. Photographs of freed prisoners lined his walls, a silent reminder of what was at stake. He opened a small envelope that had arrived earlier. Inside was a simple, handwritten note. Thank you for not forgetting us. No name, no signature needed. Jabari closed his eyes briefly, letting those words sink in. He had started this fight because of injustice done to him, but he stayed in it for everyone who couldn't fight back. Because justice wasn't just a concept, it was a promise he would never stop fighting to fulfill. The war would continue. But tonight, at least, Jabari knew one thing for certain. They would never underestimate him again.